welcome to DEFCON 3. I'm KT McFarland. This is Fleet Week in New York, and that's when the U.S. Maritime Services, the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard all descend upon New York City and have a terrific time seeing the city and letting New Yorkers see them. Joining us today is Admiral John Weigold, and he's the Deputy Director of Operations for the Pacific Command. In other words, he's not on the Atlantic Ocean, he's in the Pacific. So thank you very much for joining us. How about a quick summary of what it is you do out there in the West Coast?
Yes, KT, thanks very much first for having me, and thanks for covering Fleet Week here in New York. It's a great time of year for us. At the U.S. Pacific Command, the command headed up by a four-star Navy Admiral currently oversees all U.S. military operations in the Pacific, and that's from the coast of California all the way over almost to Africa.
Wow, that's a pretty big area of operations. So what are your biggest challenges? I mean, I know the President has said that our military strategy is going to focus less on the Middle East and we're going to pivot to Asia. Now that is primarily a Navy function, I would think. We don't have a lot of military bases, Army bases in the Western Pacific. So that's your job. What does that mean for you?
Well, yes, this is true that the Pacific is generally a maritime environment and domain area, but all services are involved at all levels in the Pacific. The Pacific, believe it or not, in our area of responsibility covers half the globe. It's 36 nations. We have two of the three largest economies in the world, the largest democracy in the world, and we also have 8 out of the 10 largest militaries in the world. It's a very active and ever-evolving area.
So what does it mean, though, for the United States Navy? Are we putting more ships there? Are we focused more attention there? We're going to have new treaties with countries there?
Yeah, so you may have heard the term pivot to the Pacific.
Right.
That was originally the term that we used. And we found that when you think about pivot, people tend to think that we're leaving one thing and going to another. So we've retermed this strategy as a rebalance, because we're not really turning our backs on anyone or any active area. And you can see in the European theater right now, the activity in Ukraine is as an example. But we're rebalancing our attention and some of our resources to the Pacific, because that's an area of increased economic activity and prosperity for the United States.
Okay, we've all seen the United States really has been dominant in the Pacific since World War II. And we've seen in the last several years the rise of the Chinese military, the Chinese Navy. How do you guys view that? Is that a threat?
Yeah, no, we believe that this is a positive development for the globe, not only the region, because China obviously, as a big player in the world, has become very prosperous based on global economic development. And our relationship with China is not only good for the two of us, but it's good for the economy of the world as a whole.
So what happens if there's an accident? What happens if there's a potential incident? We've had several in the last couple of months where Chinese military have sort of bumped up against U.S. naval forces in a region. We haven't had anything escalate, and it hasn't been anybody shooting at anybody, but get a little bit too close to comfort. So what happens in a situation like that?
Yeah, no, this is a great example of why we need to work more closely together to put those mechanisms and policies, procedures in place to deal with these kind of events.
Okay, so what happens if there is an incident? The President doesn't get on the phone with Xi Jinping. What happens?
So what we've been doing over the last several years is establishing very senior relationships, and we've been trying to push that down to lower levels so that we understand one another more often. Just as you living next to a neighbor that you never met, it's hard to develop any relationship unless you start to talk. So that's what we're starting now, and we hope to develop that further. An example of that is the Rim of the Pacific exercise we're holding starting next month in Hawaii, where we have 23 different nations coming together. It'll be the first time that China is participating in those exercises in the history of the exercise.
Okay, so those exercises go from Korea to the Philippines? I mean, what happens it's called RIMPAC, right?
Correct.
Okay,
and RIMPAC only takes place in Hawaii, but it starts with a transit from Asia to Hawaii. So it's a large exercise with a lot of international players, where a lot of different nations get to work together and create a sense of camaraderie and deepen relationships.
You spent a lot of time or some time in your career anyway, a good bit of time at senior levels in Korea. And we've seen in the last several years that there's always an annual springtime crisis with North Korea doing something, firing on a South Korean ship, threatening to blow up the world, testing missiles, testing nuclear weapons. How do you rate the situation on the Korean Peninsula and the likelihood that that could escalate either by accident or intention?
Yeah, I mean, our policy is we pay a lot of attention to Korea. It's it's an isolated yet very volatile situation there, and so that's the reason why we have so many partners and allies and friends of ours together on that problem. Our policy is to work together to try to minimize any friction there on the Korean Peninsula, because if you think about Northeast Asia, that region is responsible for one of the largest areas of trade in the globe.
You mean trade going in and out of you mean Japan, Korea, China?
China, South Korea, and Japan, and Taiwan, you have to roll in that region. That ultimate North Asia region is responsible for more trade, manufacturing, and economic development than most other parts of the world.
The Chinese have talked about the South and East China Seas and talked to them almost like they're the Great Lakes. You know, it's like internal Chinese waterways. We always focus in the trade world about, well, there's the Suez Canal, where there's the Strait of Hormuz, where oil goes out of the Persian Gulf area to the world. There's also a place like that, a narrow choke point, that's in Asia, the Straits of Malacca. What's the United States Navy prepared to do to keep that open for world trade?
Well, we talk a lot about this, obviously, and part of our responsibility at PACOM and all the commands in Asia is to focus on that sort of issue. Our view in the United States is that these are global common areas. These are areas that all countries around the world should be able to navigate freely. And so our policy is to participate in events and discussions to ensure that friends, allies, partners, and others are participating in discussions along those lines.
So that thing's going to stay open, right, no matter what?
I would say that's a good bet.
That's a safe bet. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. Admiral John Weigold, Deputy Director of Operations for the Pacific Command. And have a terrific time in New York for Fleet Week.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you. And that's it for DEF CON 3.